So good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are at in the country. We're glad you have joined us for today. For this edition of Shop Talk, we're going to be focusing on rail trail maintenance. And the more research and the more discussions I've been having, I've realized that there is a need for us to create a common language among trail managers in order to better define the concept of what is routine maintenance. And that way we can then begin to consider what are the actual costs and break it down so that we can communicate some of that up the chain of our administration. So our purpose for today is to start off a conversation. Hopefully that will lead to further conversations. We want to define what are the tasks involved in routine maintenance for rail trail management. We want to investigate some of the variables that drastically impact trail maintenance needs, and we want to learn how to break down and calculate average costs across surface types. So today I've pulled together a panel of trail managers and experts from Pennsylvania specifically, but hopefully a lot of these resources can also extrapolate to your needs if you are outside of Pennsylvania. So today we have Ron Steffi, who is a consultant and owner of Steffi Trail Connections. We also have Ed Patterson, who's the director of Indiana County Parks and Trails. We have Brian Cope, who is the superintendent of Northampton County Parks and Recreation. And we have Tom Sexton, who is the director of Northeast Region of Rails to Trails Conservancy. And Tom has been conducting national trail maintenance research, and he's been doing some focusing in Pennsylvania and trying to get more of trail counters since 2017. In the early 90s, he led advocacy for trail enhancements in Pennsylvania, and he served on the Greenway Commission here in the state. He's also a member of New Jersey Trails Council. So I'm going to hand it off to Tom and allow him to kind of introduce some of the research that he's been focusing on and start our discussion for today.
Thanks, Brian. Hello, everybody. This is good to be with you to talk about rail trail maintenance. Maintenance doesn't excite some people, but it does excite me. And I've been looking at this for several years now, and I've talked to some of you who are joining us today, and I appreciate all your help. I've tried to understand routine maintenance, that is tasks you do once a year, at least once a year on a trail, multi-purpose trail or rail trail, same thing for this discussion. And really getting an idea of what are the costs for those. But I've found over these years that it's not well documented as and even understood as a national sort of discipline. We don't really understand. Some people, when you have a conversation, maintenance means one thing, routine means something, periodic is even harder to get, at least my head around sometimes. But there's a really strong need to compare costs, because then we can compare practices and designs for our trails and save costs and create efficiencies and so on and so forth that you're always looking for, I think. Unfortunately, some of the numbers that have been shared over really decades, and some of them still live, and somewhat are not based in fact. Some of them are based on the reconstruction costs for deferred maintenance when something fails. For example, tree roots that aren't maintained and kept back from a trail and then push up the asphalt. And we see in the literature decades ago that a cost factor for asphalt maintenance got in there, and it's not maintenance, it's not routine maintenance, it's not even periodic, it's just total rebuilding. So that's just one example. The other point I think is very important, why we need good costs, Not only so we can compare apples and apples and you can talk to each other and share, but advocacy also. It's really surprising to me how we've created such a great network of trails, 40,000 miles of multi-purpose trails in the United States. And we really don't have a good figure when an elected official at a meeting asks, hey, how much is this going to cost to maintain? A trail manager may be able to share their data, but another manager might construe it, differently. And even given that, and I've been in elected officials in hearings and things like that, and even when at that level or the town level, we don't have good data, these trails are still getting built. So if we get good data, I think we can really ramp up the building of rail trails and the maintenance of rail trails and the funding for rail trails. I wanted to share with you I call it a comparison table in a second. And this was really a follow-up from, most immediately from a 2015 study where I reached out to 200 rail trail managers across the United States, mostly where it snows at least once a year. So it was mainly a north United States. And we had two other studies before that. All of these, by the way, that were funded by most of the work by the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. And I wanted to share that with you today, and hopefully that sparks some conversation and maybe involve you more and directly with me if you have the time, so we can work on this together. This table had a worksheet that you'll see somewhat portrayed on the table, but we put bundled, that is, for all the tasks that you do into four areas. One was surface maintenance, another was vegetation, another was amenities, all the benches, all the gates, everything that goes into that. And the fourth was sort of general cleaning, cleanliness and graffiti, litter, that kind of thing. It does not, and this is I've stressed that this is a baseline. This is routine stuff. It does not include management, doesn't include operations, doesn't include policing, doesn't include programming, all the other things that many of you. This is just hands-on routine maintenance tasks. One more thing I'll say before I go to the table is volunteers are so critical. Some of you work with volunteers, some of you don't have volunteers, but I've found that they're sometimes greatly undervalued, but I've included them and their value, and they have a nationally recognized value for the value of any volunteer's time. It's $25. And sometimes you get somebody who's just picking up litter, and other times you get a civil engineer or a PhD. So that range, $25 is probably the minimum. But let's go to that table, and I think it'll spark up some conversation, I hope. So here it is. It was very difficult to get these figures from the managers. They're busy, and they have different ways of preparing their budgets quite often. And no one method is better than the other, but this was a method that seemed to be fair to those that I shared my ideas with, and I think it captures the basics and gives us a footing to get more sophisticated and build on this data. And you can see wide variety in types of trail surface and locations. You can see quite a variety in who maintains the trails: volunteers, nonprofit staff, park staff, and contractors are in here also as well. So you can also see, and most importantly, and that's what we're focusing on, is the mile, the cost per mile, and really, big swing from the Schuylkill Banks in Philadelphia, which is almost, should we have it on here? Because it's an urban park. It's a dense urban park that gets a huge amount of visitors a year. And then we swing out to some of the more rural areas, and those costs are a lot less. So sometimes when we say, well, what's the average cost of a mile of routine maintenance for a rail trail, I kind of hesitate, because I don't want to take the average between $100,000 and $1,000. It's not going to really tell you much. So as we get better at portraying this and get better numbers, and again, it was really difficult to get these numbers and the other data. I think we can do a better job and maybe break it down into, and I'd love to have like 20 urban asphalt costs and 20 rural stone dust trails. And I think then we can, we'll have more validity to this. I'll lastly say and repeat sort of those four general bundles that are on the last four lines on this table, starting with surface and structures. You can see there what they all include. The surface repair, remedial, keeping the drainage structures open, culverts, right? Got to keep it open. We're seeing even culverts being even more important, given that flooding is almost routine now. I know Schuylkill Banks floods once or twice a year, and that's a big problem. Costs a lot of money and volunteer time as well to get debris and all the mud off that, for example. And then you have, some of you have bridges, you have tunnels. Again, that's bundled with surface. Vegetation, everything, okay? And this was, sometimes it was tricky because some of you may account for it a little differently. Sometimes, you're just kind of mowing grass, but is it grass or is it other vegetation? You're just kind of doing it quick. You have limited budgets. And so it was hard to always call things by their exact name. Is it grass? Is it brush? But we'll get better at that as we go. Trees are a huge thing. If you don't have a lot of trees, you have less maintenance costs. Again, maintenance costs include the volunteer hours, and they're given a value of $25. And the third bundle was level of amenities. Schuylkill Banks on one end, just really a lot of amenities. You can see the picture above. It has not only the signs and gates and et cetera, but it has a rail width. It's a rail width trail, so there's extensive fencing. There's a river, so there's a wall there, et cetera, et cetera. There's rocks that they brought in for the landscape, so very complex. And then on the other swing, maybe going out to Ron's trail, Ron Steffi, who's on the call, in the Armstrong trail, a great trail, and they have less amenities. They do have more tree growth, which takes management, but people love trees, so we want to keep those. And then lastly, that last bundle was for trash receptacles. Many of you do not have trash receptacles, or maybe have trash receptacles at the parks that your trail links to. And so they sort of do double duty for the park population and for the rail trail population. But this also includes litter removal and graffiti. So kind of giving that introduction, I'd be happy to drill down a little more, or if people want to extrapolate a little, like Ron, who worked with me on this and has some good figures there. You know, maybe that's a good way to start the discussion.
Yeah, let's have some of our other panelists kind of chime in at this point. If that's a good segue in a sense, since Ron, your trail is on this chart, you know, maybe you can kick it off and introduce yourself, which one is your trail, and then kind of go into where did your numbers come from?
I'm Ron Steffi, and I used to be the manager for the Allegheny Valley Land Trust with the Armstrong Trail. And we self-built about 30 miles of trail with volunteers over about an 8-year period. Currently now I have a consulting firm, and unlike most consultants, why I'm not trying to get projects off the ground, I'm trying to get a trail project on the ground. So I work with municipalities and nonprofits to work with them that a lot of times they just don't know where to start. So I try to work with them and get their projects on the ground. As Tom said, what's really hard is defining and being consistent on what is a routine maintenance. And I somewhat look at the routine maintenance as being something that you plan for annually. And as opposed to a surprise cost that comes up onto you because something went wrong or something you didn't plan for. So if you're planning for tasks on the trail that are routine, you're doing it annually, and you're supplying some kind of budget for that, then it becomes routine. And as Tom said, you know, lots of times it becomes very difficult whenever you're mowing. Are you mowing grass, or are you doing something further away with a brush hog that you may only do once a year or once so many years? And also with the tree trimming, you know, there's annual costs that you can have, and there may be costs that you do every 5 years or even more. So if you look at the Armstrong Trail and you look at going down to visitation and going across, you see a 69% increase from 2019 to 2020. And I think even though I'm no longer with the organization, I'm on the Armstrong Trail a good bit. And I think a lot of the increase that you may see was before, when we were building the trail, it wasn't routine maintenance. So we didn't have that cost because we were cleaning out culverts and ditches that hadn't been taken care of for about 25 years. So we didn't include that in normal maintenance. But now it is a cost that is there. So there is an increase. Plus each year, lots of times your increases become more and more with what you may have to do and have to maintain. So that's sort of a little short thing that I'll give, and I'll let others chime in also, and we can always return if someone has more specific questions.
Brian, you want to chime in, kind of give us some of your feedback from on the eastern side of Pennsylvania?
Sure. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Brian Cope. I'm Superintendent of Parks and Rec with Northampton County. We're located about an hour drive north of Philadelphia and about an hour and a half west of New York City. We're urban, suburban, and rural, all within about a 5-minute drive from downtown to outside, about a 20-minute drive from downtown Bethlehem to the Appalachian Trail. So we have a variety of landscapes that we deal with. Within our county itself, we have about 300 miles of land and water trails, and we oversee a 5-mile trail called the Norbath Trail. It was approximately built 20 years ago, and it's showing its age. This year, well, actually last year, we started doing a full-scale rehab. We milled every inch down. We in the process of resurfacing, and we're actually using a recycled concrete instead of stone to put on as the trail top. We do have an asphalt section that, because of the vegetation around, it does get a little wet and mildewy, so we had to do some tree trimming and cut back in some of those areas. And then it goes through a neighborhood where we have normal street crossings, and had to establish some new ADA curb cuts and things like that. So we really have a gambit of all types of the different steps or different aspects of the trails that Tom has shown here. We kind of came at it a little differently in the past, and we're starting to change now that we see some of this new data, but we've always looked at regular maintenance not as a budget line item for how many hours we would put towards something. It was more about our equipment that's needed to do those things. And that's where we would really put our capital money towards. So as we changed some of the techniques, we've done some different equipment purchases, but that also helps in other areas of our park system as well. We do cutbacks for large brush and trees, but maybe 3 or 4 times a year, depending on how the growth is. We cut shoulders. That's normally about once a week. You're using zero-turn John Deere tractors. We have a gator that we use if we need to kind of get guys around for trash or any kind of cleanup, or and then your simple chainsaws, pole saws, and things like that we use on a more of a daily basis, or even sometimes a weekly basis. So I think when we looked at it, we came to this as, we don't really look at the actual hours per se, but I mean, we're starting to look at that now. We actually looked at, okay, we need this type of equipment to really keep up with the work that we see as daily routine maintenance. And I think that might be a little something that differs from where Tom was focusing in on, and that's our day-to-day stuff. So I'll leave it at that, and we can open up any kind of questions for anyone else.
You know, I might add, when we first looked into this, there's a lot of staff sometimes at a park district level, or civic works or something from a town or a city, and it can get quite complex. It was really hard to, and we might be able to get this in the future. We get more engagement, but it was hard to get the rate per hour, for example, of many different people that do those tasks. So when we got some of them, and then we started to average that value, and that was a little easier to work with. And it's maybe, you know, not an exact average, because again, getting those rates per hour across a few departments within a city or a town is a lot of work for the manager. So we somewhat simplified that, and that came out to approximately $25 an hour. And that was also the nationally recognized rate of a volunteer hour. So we were able to, again, kind of compare apples and oranges, and volunteers who, some of them have their PhDs in trail maintenance and operations now, because it's their whole life. It was appropriate to combine them.
Well, and that apples to apples kind of point is definitely something that is a challenge, because we've had some questions that came in to me. You know, some folks from the Pacific Northwest up in Washington State specifically was asking, you know, about mitigation on bridges for kind of slippery slope, you know, in a sense that there was surfacing problems because, you know, being up there in a temperate rainforest, you have to worry about moss, you have to worry about different kind of vegetation building up on your surface. And so that becomes a regular maintenance task for them? You know, do they copper sulfate? Do they go and just put kitty litter down? You know, what is the kind of mitigation concerns? Whereas here in Pennsylvania, that necessarily isn't something that even people would consider a regular maintenance. Now, if you're talking about trash removal, that's a regular maintenance task. Or if you're talking about potentially even resurfacing in high traffic areas, that may end up being a maintenance task, or, you know, overgrowth when you're in certain areas and things. And so, you know, if we kind of need to really define what is regular maintenance, how do we boil that down? You know, maybe Ed, what do you define as your regular maintenance on the western side of the state?
You know, we're pretty typical with what Ron faces. We're the county that's right next door to him, so it's pretty similar. We do a lot of vegetation management, and you know, I would add also that we maintain 3 trails, and we do it with our park maintenance crew. So we're a little different. We don't use volunteers a lot. We use them for special projects, but we do Ghost Town Trail, Hoodlebug Trail, and Blairsville Riverfront Trail. But you know, we do the typical things, mowing. Now the Ghost Town Trail is a limestone dust trail, so that requires you know, maintenance of the surface, dragging, maintaining it, fixing washouts, and so on. Hoodlebug Trail is a little different. It's a seal coat trail, a double seal coated trail, so it's not asphalt. And we just did last year a resurfacing of that trail, 7 miles. Came in at about $30,000 per mile for a double seal coat. So what we use is we use a number 8 stone for the base and the number 9 stone for the top, which is basically just like the fines that you see in limestone dust, but without the dust. And, you know, it gives you a nice alternative to asphalt. And we've been really pleased with that kind of surface. And Blairsville Trail, Riverfront Trail is a challenge. It's our shortest trail. It's only about 2 miles long, but it happens to be located along a Army Corps flood control area. So it's not unusual for that trail to be under 40 feet of water, you know, maybe even once or twice a year. So when that water recedes, then we've got lots of silt to deal with and lots of cleanup to do. And it's definitely been a challenge for us, but it's a trail that people in the community absolutely love. So, but you know, we do the typical things. And I will say one other thing. Our philosophy with trail maintenance is a little different maybe than some other folks. We look at the trails as more as linear parks. So our philosophy is that we maintain them very similar to what we do with our parks. And we're very big on having facilities for people to use, restrooms and access areas and so on. And I will say, if you have you know, restrooms and so on that are well maintained, you're going to draw people in, because a lot of rail trails don't have facilities. And we get folks from the Pittsburgh area, out from down in Maryland, Eastern PA. And the one thing they will comment on is the fact that we do have facilities, and they're you know, pretty well maintained. So that's sort of the angle that we take with it. We, even if they're rail trails, we consider them to be more like linear parks. So. All right.
Well, and that's a great comment, because I know, Tom, you've brought that up too, the mindset of a trail being an actual park location as opposed to being a pathway, even though our state, you know, is considering that being alternative travel routes and things, but it really is a destination for people.
Yeah, it's true. There's probably one I'd like to examine, for example, parks or rail trails similar to Schuylkill Banks in the Pittsburgh area. I think we'll find some similarities there. And again, you know, I have some other trail data from other trails, maybe not quite as complete, and I wanted to represent the whole country here. But I think as we get we get more data, we can draw some conclusions. I'd like to put I'd like to have a Pennsylvania slide like you're seeing now. I'd like to have, now I deal with the Northeast, the 10 states in the Northeast, but I'd be happy to work with anybody from other states who, from their DNR or their rail trail group who would like to, build something out like this in the state. That would be great.
So kind of jumping on that, do you find the Northeast can be, I guess, have a common definition, or is it more of a regional kind of mindset where, Eastern Pennsylvania is different than Western Pennsylvania, and therefore we need to think of differently? Or can we create, common thoughts no matter where you're at of this is a defined maintenance task that is required regularly?
I think they're definitely, everybody's doing one of those 4 bundles on the left-hand side on the bottom. Whether they're doing, and basically there's about 6 sub tasks under each of those 4 bundles. Not everybody is doing every one of those. If you don't have trees, you're not doing some of that. If it's very, very rural, doesn't have a lot of amenities, it's been run by volunteers, it perhaps is, a very basic trail. But especially rail trails, they tend to be similar. Of course, asphalt, stone dust, and I even have the concrete one in here. I don't know if you noticed the one from Lincoln, Nebraska. And I don't want anybody to run out and buy concrete because you see that figure is so low. That's a good figure. However, that represents some, maybe they have about a half mile that's at the end of that 5 miles. That's more of a sidewalk type of situation, because the historical rail trail corridor was not available to them, and they have no tree growth. Also, their amenities are very low that they maintain, because the few places that they have drinking fountains, garbage cans, that kind of thing, that's really at separate parks and those park heads, those trail heads at those parks. So they're not included in this because they don't maintain that. So I don't know if I'm doing a good job answering your question, but I think there are they're very similar. I would think this was an easier task than, say, what the Institute works on, and all of your members at PRPS is, just the bigger word of parks. I mean, gosh, that's a hard one to get your head around. But I'm hoping that my little foray into this world of rail trail maintenance, I might, learn a lot more from more the main line park practices and experts.
Well, and the goal of the Institute, is to help specifically the boots on the ground and the operation mindset of becoming more strategic, starting to think of things more carefully, and putting the mindset of it's not just one budget line, is how can we break things down and how can we be more efficient in operations to make sure that we can focus more on trails if they need it, so that other things can maybe take care of themselves. And so along that kind of mindset, I'm going to put the question out to everyone involved here. You can use that chat box or even chime in, drop off your mute, but I'm going to kind of put it up to Ron, Ed, and Brian, at least at first, of, where is the mindset that you deal with? How do you break down, or how are you thinking you may break down your costs more, as opposed to just say maintenance budget? How can we make things in smaller bites and look at things with a more critical eye to make sure our efficiencies are there and we're not wasting time?
Well, this is Ron, and I think with the different those four bundles that Tom referred to, they can be broken down into, and we have some data, but we're still gathering data that one trail can really make a big difference in the cost of an annual budget. So again, we're looking at where do we spend a lot of our time on a trail, and where are our problems, and where do we spend a lot of money, and trying to identify those and seeing and comparing it to other trails on what are they doing, and is our cost in line or is it higher, and then looking at why it may be higher. It may be that there's another task that you're not doing that could be lowering it. An example would be what Tom said with roots heaving the asphalt. Well, if you're resurfacing, you have a lot of cost there for resurfacing. Maybe the task that you're missing is that you're not trenching and cutting those roots off before they come there. So I think our hope is to look at this in the future and start to define those bundles somewhat and look at them in a smaller group. It's always hard to start. Where do you start with maintenance? And we're doing sort of an overview here now that can be divided up, and I think others can also put their information on what they have and how they define it. But every trail is different, so it's hard to get, as Tom said, one fits all. So we're always trying to see what makes it apples to apples, and the cost may be different, but I think it's important for the managers to look at, why are my costs different? Am I doing something better, or am I doing something that or I'm not doing something that I could be doing? And those are the questions that can come up by looking at what you have in a budget.
And I'll chime in. I think what Ron just mentioned is dead on, and what Tom has provided here is a blueprint to move forward and get in and start looking at these things a little differently. I said earlier that we never really looked at maintenance like this, per hour, per thing like that. We looked at what kind of equipment. Just knowing some of the trails in the region around the Lehigh Valley here, there's multi-municipal agreements, there's extensive volunteer groups. So I think using that and then looking at the daily maintenance, but also the capacity or the use of the trail plays a major role into it as well. So I think what Ron talked about is of like even looking at the entrenching, if you're going to resurface, make sure those tree roots are moved. We need to look at all of that, but we can really start using what Tom has provided here as a blueprint to dive in more and start collecting those as a way to move forward as a trail manager that all of us can talk about consistently and in the same tracks then.
Now, along with this, in a sense, would you all consider training as part of a regular maintenance cost as well? We had somebody just finally chimed into the chat box there, but they're mentioning that, routine cutting and trimming back and pruning and doing things properly. It's one thing to just go back and mow everything down. It's another thing to go back and properly trim so that you don't get all the water sprouts and you don't create more of a problem by just mowing it all down. So is that something that should be considered as a regular maintenance cost as well as training staff and making sure people are doing the job right?
Yeah, I think that's a big thing is doing the training. And an example of what you're doing on pruning, so many people, if you have a tree coming out or a branch, and it comes out to where the treadway is where you're traveling. A lot of people will just cut it right there so that no one's hitting it, instead of taking it back to where the trunk is and pruning it there. So with them cutting it here, you come back the next year, now you have two, it's forked. You have two branches to cut instead of taking care of it. So I think the little things like that can really decrease some of your overall cost, but it has to be training, and people have to, they'll give you more if they're trained and they realize the value of what they're doing, and that they're not just out there to do something that it's one and done, that what they're doing is providing for months or years or so, that you can forget about this section, go to another section, do another task. So I think training is one of the most important features of trail maintenance.
And I would take that one step further and also almost a plant identification. If you have an extensive invasive plant area, that kind of like honeysuckle, if you cut it, it takes it over. Those are different maintenance techniques that you're going to need in certain areas of your trail then. So I mean, that's excellent point by Ron, especially for volunteers. If they're going to go out and help prune and things like that, show them the right way. So it's not next year we're coming back and we're having a threefold prod on that, and they're doing it so it's going to last a couple years down the road.
Well,
Yeah.
and that kind of goes along too with the question in senses, what is more appropriate for a volunteer group to do versus a full-time staff, or is it literally just a training question where as long as it's a trained volunteer, then it's not a concern, whereas, you know, sometimes volunteers become a task in themselves?
This may not directly answer that yet, but I found a really, maybe I expressed this in the beginning, a really wide continuum of volunteer capacities. I'm familiar with Day of Giving, and they come out and pick up litter and maybe put a paintbrush and they take care of some graffiti. But then it goes the whole way over. I remember I went out and on the Schuylkill banks, and I saw 5 gentlemen, hard hats, vests, and everything, and they were stabilizing the shoulder, and they were pounding after putting in dirt. They were pounding that in so that people from the asphalt wouldn't break an ankle. And when you get over 1 million people a year, people will walk on the side and it'll compact. And so they have to constantly keep up with that. And I thought, wow, these guys are doing a good job. I took a picture and then I don't know how we started to talk, but I said, oh, you guys, it seems like you know what you're doing. He says, yeah, we come out once a month for half a day, usually Fridays, at lunch, and kick off the rest of the weekend. And he would, and they were civil engineers, all of them from a firm about 3 blocks away. But you get that real continuum. So I've learned that the volunteer hours are just so critical. And even that, the litter pickup. I mean, we tried to understand how much time staff people pick up litter, and it's just they couldn't really say if they were patrolling and they're more of in a surveillance capacity. They see trash, they'll pick it up. If they're maintenance, they'll pick it up. If they're doing programming with people or whatever, they see trash, they pick it up. So a lot of this just is really, really hard to get captured. But I think as we go, we can develop better methodologies and subsets of a lot of this. But it's hard stuff to gather, because I can't necessarily gather it. It's trail managers have to take time away from being out on the trail to help me out. But I think it's really it's really worthwhile. And I know that we get a call, and once we put this on our website and DCNR's website, we'll get a call and they'll say, hey, I'd like to talk to the person from Lincoln, Nebraska, and because I want to understand more about the figures. I mean, I'm going to ask them, well, geez, could I work with you to put together your own budget and put you on this page? Because it's sometimes they say, no, I just want somebody else's figures, and it's like, I don't want them to do that. I want them to have their own figures to help us out as well as themselves.
Well, and that's a great segue too, because we do have your spreadsheet that we would like to share with everyone here that is interested. I've put it on the Institute website, but also if you put your email address in the chat box there, we will follow up and try to gather some of your data and help you figure out regular maintenance costs and figuring out how to put some of this stuff in an organized format to think a little bit more strategically, but also to help the cause in creating some more of these best practices. Now, you mentioned I was trying to help you collect some of the data in itself. And have you found a methodology that works in pulling some of this data from the same trail that goes across multiple municipalities? Like, for example, we were looking at the Saucon Trail, and that ended up going across 4 different municipalities that were trail managers, but they didn't look at it as one continuous trail. It was essentially 4 separate trails. So, I mean, is there ways to work with neighboring municipalities or ways to kind of reach out that olive branch to create some of those conversations that you find work?
That's a tough one, Brian. I kind of, well, you know, a trail with one name could have 4 different town government entities that maintains it, and then on top of that, 2 of those 4 have contractors that help them out, and the other 2 or 3 of them have volunteers. And it was just like so difficult to get that data. I think if I got that data, I could do it, but it's pretty hard. I have some of those sort of half-baked that aren't on the screen now, but that's a difficult one. However, if I'm able to do that, what that gives us is the potential to show the efficiency of scale. And by that, I mean that, okay, 4 miles, 4 different entities, 4 different towns, whatever, that are maintaining this, do they all need their own mower? Do they all need, you know, their this equipment? Can they share? And I think those are the things that, especially as we create bigger, longer networks of trails throughout the United States. I mean, it sounds like we have a lot, 40,000 miles. And that it's impressive, but there's still, you know, huge gaps. But I think there's people are starting to ask those questions about, should we have a program with the other 3 municipalities, and we'll do the mowing and somebody else will do vegetation control because they sort of have some of that equipment already or whatever. You know, I think some of that is organically going on, but I think we can really make the case for that and save you all, you know, budgets and time. If we can say, oh, we have a baseline, so let's try it and see if it works. Without a baseline, those kinds of efficiencies, attempts at efficiencies, or redesigning trails, different practices, etc. Unless we have a baseline, you can't really tell if your new actions saved you money. You don't, or at least in an easy way. And then folks like us, that as an advocate for the nation, can say, hey, this works, right? And we have data to support that. And we have 5 trails that tried it and it works. So it's bona fide, you know? Yeah.
And this tool is is there a way, there was a great comment in the chat box there that, you know, Bill from Morris Township made a comment that, you know, his trails aren't necessarily as highly developed as far as infrastructure wise of the trails on the table. But are there pieces of this data that maybe could be used to help analyze some of the things for trails with variable width, trails that aren't necessarily rail trails, you know, over natural terrain and those kind of things? He mentions that a lot of his routine maintenance tasks are vegetation cutbacks and drainage issues, but are there things that can be extrapolated from rail trails to all trails, or are they apples and oranges?
Yeah. Hey, hi, Bill. I'm going to be talking to you next week. You're in Morris County, right? New Jersey. Yeah.
Yes, I am. Yeah.
Hey. Good to see you.
Back in here.
All
here.
I think that's difficult, Bill. If I was, and I can't recall if part of the Patriots Path Trail that goes through most of Morris County, New Jersey, is part of your complex, is it?
We have connections to Patriots Path in Morris Township, but I also work out in Chester Township, where we actually have some spur trails. The main trail of Patriots Path goes through our parks. So we have a bit of both on Patriots Path and longer distance. Okay. Those are typically not very wide trails, again, natural soils trails. You know, I think to the point that Bill made earlier that, you know, there may be bits of information about, you know, costs. Certainly the costs for us are different based on the type of individual. If I'm using township staff, that, you know, there's a cost for employees. If I'm predominantly using volunteers, obviously that's a lot lower cost. I see most of Patriots Path being maintained now by county labor forces or municipal labor forces. So they might have a little bit higher cost than some of the sections that are being covered by some volunteer groups.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I think it's possible to use the spreadsheet and some of these categories. I wonder also if like the Patriots Path, sometimes there might be mountain bikes on it, or maybe they're not allowed, but they're still there. But it's a walking, maybe closer to a hiking trail in some sections. And I wonder if, you know, folks like the New Jersey, New York Trails Conference have methodologies to do, you know, kind of maintenance budgets. I'm not sure, but I just wonder that. But I don't have a real good answer for that, except I think, yeah, they're not quite as complex because they're not asphalt. Maybe you don't have quite as many amenities, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So it would be, maybe it's simpler to do that. But I think the same mindset going into this with those kinds of trails is needed if you're really going to understand if the things that you're doing are working, and is change warranted, and is somebody else who says, hey, this works over at my trail, can you compare apples and apples?
And to add on to a little bit with what Tom was saying, I'm starting to see where a municipality are starting to draft some agreements to what the volunteers are doing. So the volunteers understand exactly what they're to do. An example would be the volunteers don't use any chainsaws. If it takes a chainsaw, the employees of the municipality are going to do it, or they'll hire someone to do it. So as you start to define that, you're sort of going down through the categories and defining the different categories and the different costs, so that it gives you somewhere to start. It shows you some of the tasks, and people realize, well, this is something they can do. This is something we can easily do. And even as you go over municipality borders, that as Tom says, we're seeing a little bit more in that, but some of it isn't always official agreements. That there's one town that they used to mow a mile into the next borough, and the reason was given, well, the real reason was they had the equipment to do it, but they gave the reason, well, that's the best turnaround point, and with us going up another mile, it's actually easier for us to turn around and come down the other side. So you know, I think the steps and the categories can be taken even further as we start to develop agreements and people understand exactly what their responsibilities are.
Well,
Yeah.
we're coming up on our hour here, and I know some people got to jump off right away, but this is very obvious to me that, you know, this is such a broad topic. We were definitely going to have to continue to investigate this and kind of break it down more and discuss it more. But before we end for today, I'm going to open it up to our panelists here to kind of say some closing words. And since Brian, you have the most tight schedule, do you want to start off with some final thoughts?
Sure. So I just want to thank everyone for attending today, and Tom and Ron for their expertise in this field here. We're definitely going to look at this year and use this matrix to kind of dive in even further. And I'm going to pass it off to some of my counterparts here in the Lehigh Valley and see if we can come up with a more generalized, comprehensive listing, so all of us can talk maybe this time next year on the same topics here.
Great.
Thanks, Brian. Ed, you want to chime in?
Yeah, I just want to say that, you know, this really is important information because, you know, your politicians and citizens always want to know, especially when it's a new project, they want to know what's it going to cost to maintain. And in fact, I just had a group that contacted me. They want to do it's a short trail. It's only about 4-mile rail trail project. And they came to me, and that was the first question they asked: what would it cost for us to maintain this section of trail? So the work that Tom has done here and continues to do, I think, is important, and it's good to share it. Can't always compare every trail to each other, but there's a lot of similarities that will get you some decent numbers to work with. It's not an exact science, but you know, it's come a long ways from when I first started back in 1990 with rail trails. So,
Thanks, Ed. Ron?
Well, I know Tom always doesn't, he likes to concentrate on the maintenance, but I always go back to the design. And I think with our maintenance costs, we're starting to see, okay, if this was designed different, we could maintain it a lot easier. So, you know, that's something that's added on to this. And I think there's a lot of topics that can be talked about in the future. But I just wanted to put this in that a lot of times the design is tougher just because, or the maintenance is tougher just because of how it's designed. And that's where Tom said about having the civil engineers out there. That's great. And maybe they're the ones that can be training. It doesn't take the management to train, that some of these volunteers and other people can actually be the ones that are training the people how to prune right, how to, what's the best management practices for stormwater, and et cetera, et cetera. And I could go on and on and on and on, but thank you for having us. I appreciate this. And I look forward to doing more of this.
And you make a great point that the boots on the ground really are the strength of our organizations, because they're the ones doing the work every day. And sometimes director level and administration level kind of overlooks the insights and the experience that is already there, and the wealth of knowledge that they may be able to pull on that they're already employing before they go outside to a third party and think about things at that consultant level. You know, we are our own internal consultants if we listen sometimes. Tom, I want to open it up for you to close us out and kind of let us know how to, you know, further get in touch with you. I mentioned, I put some things in the chat there as far as how to look into the Institute and see where our resources are at, some of our future events we're going to be putting together. But where can we find you, and how can we keep you involved?
Yeah, it's easy. Tom at rails2trails.org. And our website is easy to find. Just Google Rail Trails. But I'd be happy to work with anybody and to build this out. And one thing I touched on in the beginning, but I didn't give you enough detail, was that 2015 study that went out to 200 managers. That was over 100 questions. One of the questions, or a couple of the questions, dealt with costs, and we found that there wasn't a good handle on those. So that's why we followed up with this more deeper dive. But those other 100+ questions are really valuable, and I'll send that study to Brian. Perhaps if he has everybody's email, he can throw that out there. But that really broke down the percentages of how much trail manager are spending on vegetation and upkeep of amenities and et cetera, et cetera. It was very useful for that. And it was really a national study. So that might be something that also will be useful to everybody. But yeah, thanks for all the good discussion here. This has been great.
Yeah, so I want to thank everyone for participating. Please reach out to me. I am looking for your questions so that I can help answer them. And it doesn't have to necessarily only be trails. The Park Maintenance Institute is focusing holistically on operations and maintenance topics. So that could be anywhere from asset management to pruning best practices. So I have been creating a database, and it has been ever growing since we started in January last year. So let me know how I can help you, and let's see how we can collaborate. So I want to thank you to Brian, Tom, Ed, Ron. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat, and I look forward to our future conversations as we kind of dig a little deeper into this topic and see what we can really pull out to keep our trails in good shape, but also make sure that we are educating the administration as well, so that they continue to fund our efforts and see some of the value in what we are providing. So from the Pennsylvania Park Maintenance, I'm BK. I look forward to hosting you again in the future. Thanks, everybody.